Sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones keeping the biggest secrets. When you lose family, you realize how many words were left unsaid, how many questions will never get answered. Jed Holt learned this the hard way when his brother died and left him a worthless piece of land they'd never even talked about. The property had nothing but weeds and a strange ring of burned posts that locals avoided. Most folks said the ground was cursed, but Jed was 67 years old and figured he'd seen enough of life to know real from nonsense. When he finally went to see what his brother had left him, those blackened posts made him curious. They stood in a perfect circle, like they were marking something. So he grabbed a shovel and started digging. What he found buried between those posts changed everything. What could make a quiet mountain man suddenly rich? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jed Holt had always been a man of few words and fewer regrets, but sitting in that cramped lawyer's office in Millerville, Montana, he found himself drowning in both. The worn brass compass in his weathered hands had belonged to his father and his father's father, before that 3 generations of mountain men who'd made their living from the unforgiving wilderness that stretched beyond the valley. The compass needle pointed true north, just as it had for over a century, but Jed felt more lost than he had in decades. "Your brother Marcus left specific instructions," Attorney William Hayes was saying, his voice cutting through Jed's thoughts like a dull axe through hardwood. "The property transfers to you automatically, but only if you claim it within 90 days of his passing." Jed's thumb traced the smooth surface of the compass face, a habit he'd developed over the years when thinking hard about something. Marcus had been dead 2 weeks now, found in that Denver hospital bed, with nobody but the nurses to witness his last breath. 40 years. 40 years since they'd spoken more than a handful of words to each other, and now this. What's so special about this land that he'd put conditions on it? Jed asked, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a man who'd spent more time talking to mountains than to people. Hayes shuffled through the papers on his mahogany desk, a piece of furniture that looked as out of place in this frontier town as Jed felt in his Sunday clothes. The property is approximately 200 acres, located about 30 miles northeast of here. According to the deed, it's been in your family since 1882. Your great-grandfather, Samuel Holt, was the original owner. The name hit Jed like a cold wind off the peaks. Samuel Holt, the grandfather, he'd heard whispered stories about around campfires when he was just a boy. The old-timer who'd supposedly struck it rich in the gold, the fields before everything went to hell during the Panic of 1893. Family legend said Samuel had hidden his fortune somewhere in the mountains, but Jed had always figured that, for the kind of tall tales mountain folk liked to spin when the whiskey was flowing. "Has anybody been working the land?" Jed asked. "No, sir. It's been sitting empty for the better part of 30 years. Your brother paid the taxes on it religiously, but as far as anyone knows, he never set foot on the property." That sounded like Marcus, methodical, dutiful, keeping things in order from a distance. Even as boys, Marcus had been the one with the plans and the patience, while Jed preferred to trust his instincts and let the trail take him where it would. Maybe that's where things had started to go wrong between them. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, studying Jed with the careful expression of a man who'd learned to read character in faces weathered by mountain living. "There is one more thing, Mr. Holt. The locals, well, they have some peculiar notions about that particular piece of ground." "What kind of notions?" "They say it's cursed. Something about a fire that happened decades ago, and some strange markers left behind. Most folks in these parts won't even drive past the property line if they can help it." Jed almost smiled at that. In 67 years of mountain living, he'd learned that what city people called superstition, country people called experience. Still, he'd also learned that sometimes experience could lead you astray just as sure as ignorance could. The walk back to his truck gave Jed time to think, which was something he'd been doing too much of lately. Millerville hadn't changed much since his last visit 5 years ago, still the same weathered storefronts, the same old-timers sitting on the porch of Murphy's General Store, watching the world go by like they were keeping score of something. The mountains that ringed the valley stood eternal and patient, their peaks catching the late afternoon sun in shades of gold and purple that reminded him why he'd never been able to leave this country for long. His truck was a 1987 Ford that had seen better decades, but it started on the second try and knew every back road in 3 counties. As he drove the familiar route back to his cabin, Jed's mind wandered to memories he'd kept buried for the better part of 4 decades. Marcus had been 2 years younger, but always seemed older somehow, always thinking 3 steps ahead, while Jed was still figuring out step 1. They'd been close, once closer than most brothers, their father used to say. They'd trapped together in the high country, shared the kind of silence that only comes between people who truly understand each other. But then came that winter of 1984, when everything between them had gone sideways over a woman, and words that couldn't be taken back. Sarah Mackenzie had been the prettiest girl in 3 counties, with auburn hair that caught the light like autumn leaves, and a laugh that could make even the grimmest old trapper forget his troubles. Both brothers had loved her, though neither had admitted it to the other until it was too late. When she'd chosen Marcus, Jed had felt something break inside him that went deeper than pride. When she died in that car accident 6 months later, that break had turned into a chasm that neither brother had known how to cross. The cabin came into view as Jed rounded the last bend, a solid structure of hand-hewn logs that his father had built in 1952, situated on 20 acres of good bottom land with a creek running through it. The place wasn't much to look at, but it had everything a man needed: fresh water, good hunting, and enough solitude to hear yourself think. Jed had added a workshop and expanded the kitchen over the years, but otherwise kept it much the same as his father had left it. Inside, the familiar sense of wood smoke and coffee grounds greeted him like old friends. He hung his good jacket on the peg by the door and reached for the flannel shirt that had been his uniform for most of his adult life. The compass went into his shirt pocket, where he could feel its weight against his chest, a reminder of the men who'd come before him and the responsibilities they'd carried. The evening stretched ahead of him with the kind of quiet that most people found unsettling, but Jed had learned to appreciate. He built up the fire in the stone hearth, more for the comfort of the flames than for warmth, and settled into his father's old rocking chair with a cup of coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. The inheritance papers lay on the kitchen table where he'd dropped them, official documents that connected him to a piece of family history he'd never bothered to explore. 200 acres of cursed ground, according to the locals. A worthless patch of dirt that his brother had kept in the family for reasons Jed couldn't begin to understand. But Marcus had always been the keeper of family stories, the one who'd listened when their grandfather spun tales about the old days. Jed had been too restless, too eager to make his own stories to pay much attention to the ones that came before. Now, with Marcus gone and no one left to remember, those old stories felt like treasures he'd let slip through his fingers. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the high country. Winter was coming early this year. Jed could feel it in his bones, the way his father had taught him. Soon, the passes would be closed, and the mountain would settle into its long sleep, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his regrets. He pulled the compass from his pocket and watched the needle swing to true north, steady and reliable as the mountains themselves. His great-grandfather Samuel had carried this compass through the gold fields and back again, had used it to navigate through country that existed mostly on hand-drawn maps and hope. What had the old man seen in this land that made him fight to keep it in the family? What had Marcus seen that made him hold on to it for 30 years? The fire crackled and settled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Somewhere out in the darkness, an owl called to its mate, the sound lonely and wild. Jed had spent his whole life in country like this, had learned to read the signs that told him when weather was coming, when game was moving, when trouble was brewing. But family had always been harder to figure out than any mountain trail. Tomorrow, he'd have to make a decision about the inheritance. He could sign the papers and let the land go back to the state, could wash his hands of whatever memories or mysteries Marcus had left behind. Or he could drive out to that cursed ground and see for himself what all the fuss was about. The compass needle held steady, pointing the way forward, just as it had for generations of Holt men. Jed closed his eyes and listened to the wind in the pines, waiting for the kind of clarity that usually came to him in the quiet hours before dawn. But tonight, all he heard was the echo of 40 years of silence and the weight of questions he'd never learned to ask. The drive to the inherited property took Jed through country he hadn't seen in decades, rolling hills that gave way to broken terrain, dotted with scrub pine and granite outcroppings. The old survey map he'd found, tucked in with the inheritance papers, lay spread across his passenger seat, its edges yellowed with age and marked with notations in faded ink. According to the document dated 1882, the land had been surveyed by one Ezra Whitman, who'd noted unusual stone markers in circular formation near the center of the property. Jed's truck bounced along the two-track road that served as the only access to the land, following fence lines that had long since given up any pretense of keeping anything in or out. The morning was crisp and clear, with a clear kind of blue sky that made the mountains look close enough to touch. But there was something about this particular stretch of country that felt different, emptier somehow, like the land itself was holding its breath. When he finally reached the property line, marked by a rusted gate hanging open on broken hinges, Jed understood why the locals had their superstitions. The landscape beyond the gate looked like something out of a fever dream. What should have been grassland was instead a patchwork of barren ground and scattered vegetation, as if the earth itself couldn't decide what it wanted to grow. And there, rising from the center of a natural clearing like the bones of some ancient creature, stood the ring of posts that had sparked his curiosity. Jed parked the truck and walked slowly toward the circle, his boots crunching on ground that seemed harder and more brittle than it should have been. The posts there were 12 of them, stood roughly 8 feet tall, and were clearly hand-hewn, though time and weather had stripped away most of their bark. What caught his attention immediately was the way they'd been burned. These weren't just charred logs, they'd been deliberately blackened, each one showing the same pattern of controlled burning that spoke of human intention rather than wildfire. As he moved closer, Jed could see that the posts weren't randomly placed. They formed a perfect circle, with each post positioned exactly the same distance from its neighbors. At the base of each post, someone had placed stones, not just any stones, but carefully selected granite pieces that had been shaped and fitted together, like the foundation of a building that had never been built. Wouldn't go any closer if I were you. Jed spun around to find an old man emerging from a stand of aspen trees at the edge of the clearing. The stranger was probably pushing 80, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. He wore faded overalls and a wool coat that had seen better decades, and he moved with the careful gait of someone whose joints had been arguing with mountain winters for too long. "Name's Charlie Dunbar," the old man said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I live about 2 miles south of here. Saw the dust from your truck and figured I'd better come see who was poking around this place." Jed Holt. "This is my land now, inherited it from my brother." Charlie's expression shifted from suspicion to something that might have been sympathy. "Your brother, you say? Would that be Marcus Holt?" "You knew Marcus?" "Met him a few times over the years. He'd come out here maybe once or twice a year, always alone, always asking questions about the old days." Charlie gestured toward the circle of posts. "He was mighty interested in these markers, just like you seem to be." Jed looked back at the strange formation. "What do you know about them?" "More than I care to, truth be told. Charlie pulled a tobacco pouch from his coat pocket and began the ritual of rolling a cigarette. My grandfather used to tell stories about this place, said there was a homestead here once, back in the 1892. Belonged to some family named Holt. That'd be your people, I'm guessing. The connection hit Jed like a cold wind. My great-grandfather Samuel had a place out here. According to the old-timers, he did. Built himself a fine house, had a barn and outbuildings, even tried his hand at farming for a while. But then came the fire. Charlie struck a match and lit his cigarette, the smoke drifting away on the morning breeze. Story goes that Samuel Holt had himself some kind of falling out with certain folks in town. Money troubles, they said, though nobody knew for sure what kind. One night in the winter of 1895, his whole place went up in flames. House, barn, everything. What about Samuel? What happened to him? That's where the story gets strange. Some folks said he died in the fire. Others claimed they saw him loading a wagon in the middle of the night, heading up into the high country with what was left of his family. The truth of it is, nobody really knows. What's certain is that after that fire, nobody wanted to rebuild here. They said the ground was cursed. Jed studied the posts with new eyes. These markers, they're where the buildings used to stand? That's what my grandfather always claimed. Said Samuel Holt set those posts himself before he disappeared, marking the spots where his life's work had stood. Burned them black as a reminder of what he'd lost, or maybe as a warning to anybody who came after. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together in Jed's mind. If this had been Samuel's homestead, and if the family stories about hidden gold had any truth to them, then maybe Marcus hadn't been chasing shadows after all. Maybe there really was something here worth finding. Your brother seemed to think there was more to the story, Charlie continued. He spent hours out here with metal detectors and surveying equipment, measuring distances and taking notes. Always said he was trying to understand what Samuel had been thinking when he placed these markers. Did he ever find anything? Charlie shrugged. If he did, he never told me about it. But I'll say this, Marcus Holt was a persistent man. He kept coming back, year after year, like he was working on some kind of long-term project. Last time I saw him was maybe 3 years ago. He seemed different that day, more excited than usual. Said he'd finally figured out the pattern. What pattern? Couldn't tell you. He was always pretty tight-lipped about his theories. But he did say something interesting that day. Said these posts weren't just marking where buildings used to be. Said they were pointing to something. Jed felt his pulse quicken. Pointing to what? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Charlie dropped his cigarette and ground it out under his boot heel. Look, Mr. Holt, I know this is your land, and you've got every right to do what you want with it. But if you're thinking about digging around out here, you might want to be careful. This place has a way of getting under a man's skin. Your brother, he was a good man, but toward the end there, he seemed a little obsessed with whatever secrets he thought this ground was hiding. After Charlie left, Jed spent another hour walking the circle, studying each post and the ground around it. The survey map in his hand showed the original property boundaries, but it was the handwritten notations that caught his attention. Someone, probably Marcus, had made careful measurements and sketched additional details in the margins. There were arrows pointing from each post toward the center of the circle, and a series of numbers that might have been distances or compass bearings. In the exact center of the circle, Jed found something that made him stop and kneel for a closer look. The ground here, it was different, darker somehow, and when he scraped away the surface layer of dirt with his boot, he found what looked like the remains of a stone foundation. Not much, just a few carefully placed rocks that might have once supported a building's corner posts. But it was enough to confirm that Charlie's story had some truth to it. As the sun reached its zenith and the shadows of the posts grew short and sharp, Jed made a decision that would change everything. He walked back to his truck, pulled a folding shovel from the toolbox, and returned to the center of the circle. If Samuel Holt had hidden something here, if Marcus had spent years trying to solve this puzzle, then maybe it was time for the last of the Holt men to finish what his family had started. The first bite of the shovel into the hard ground sent a satisfying vibration up through his arms. Whatever secrets this cursed land was keeping, Jed intended to find them. The cabin Jed discovered at the northern edge of the time property was like finding a piece of his brother's soul preserved in weathered logs and rusted tin. Marcus had built it simple but solid, one room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and windows positioned to catch the morning light. It wasn't meant for comfort so much as function, the kind of place a man might use as a base camp for a long campaign against the unknown. Jed pushed open the door, which hung straight despite decades of mountain weather, and stepped into what felt like a monument to obsession. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and hand-drawn diagrams. Newspaper clippings about local history were pinned alongside geological surveys and copies of mining claims dating back to the 1,880 seconds. But it was the leather-bound journal lying open on the rough-hewn table that drew Jed's attention like a magnet draws iron. Marcus's handwriting hadn't changed since they were boys, still the same careful script that their mother had praised as neat as a preacher's sermon. The journal fell open to an entry dated just 3 months before Marcus's death. March 15th. Finally found grandfather's mining records in the Denver archives. Samuel Holt wasn't just a homesteader, he was a legitimate gold miner with claims registered in 3 counties. The records show he pulled over $50,000 worth of ore from the Broken Creek site in 1894. That's nearly $2 million in today's money. Question remains, what happened to it? Jed flipped through the pages, watching 4 years of research unfold in his brother's methodical documentation. Marcus had traced every piece of Samuel's story, from his arrival in Montana Territory through the mysterious fire that had destroyed his homestead. But more than that, he'd built a compelling case that their great-grandfather had been far more successful than family legend suggested. May 2nd. Spoke with elderly woman in Millerville whose grandfather knew Samuel. She remembers hearing that Samuel never trusted banks after the panic of 1893. Said he was convinced another financial collapse was coming and kept his wealth where God and government couldn't touch it. The phrase stuck with her all these years. The entries grew more excited as Marcus began to connect historical records with physical evidence on the land. He'd found fragments of melted glass and twisted metal in the area where the house had stood, confirming the fire had been intense enough to destroy everything above ground. But he'd also discovered something else, evidence that Samuel had been digging extensively before the fire occurred. August 10th, metal detector found iron fragments in circular pattern around the burned posts. They're not random, they follow exact spacing that corresponds to surveying measurements from the original land grant. Samuel was marking something. The posts aren't just memorial markers, they're a map. Jed set the journal down and looked around the cabin with new appreciation for his brother's dedication. This wasn't the work of a weekend treasure hunter or someone chasing childhood fantasies. Marcus had approached the mystery like a detective working a cold case, gathering evidence piece by piece until a picture began to emerge. On the wall above the table, Marcus had created what looked like a master diagram of the property. The 12 burned posts were marked with precise measurements, and lines were drawn, connecting them in various patterns. At the center of the diagram, where the lines intersected most frequently, Marcus had written a single word in red ink. Here, but Jed's attention was drawn to something else, a collection of photographs pinned to one corner of the wall. They showed the property as it existed now, but also included what appeared to be much older images. One photograph, sepia-toned and cracked with age, showed a prosperous-looking homestead with a large house, several outbuildings, and what looked like a mine shaft entrance carved into the hillside behind the main residence. Jed studied the old photograph carefully. If this was Samuel's place, Then the burned posts marked more than just building locations. They marked the sites of a substantial operation that had been deliberately destroyed. But why would a man burn down his own prosperous homestead? And why would he mark the location so precisely unless he planned to return? A loose page fell from the journal as Jed turned it, revealing a hand-drawn family tree that went back 5 generations. Marcus had traced the Holt lineage with the same methodical precision he'd applied to everything else, but it was the notations beside Samuel's name that caught Jed's attention. Marcus had written, "Disappeared 1,895 last seen, heading toward high country with loaded wagon. Possible destination, winter cabin near Broken Creek. Research suggests he had advance warning of trouble." The implications were starting to crystallize in Jed's mind. If Samuel had known the fire was coming, if he'd had time to prepare, then he might have had time to hide his wealth before disappearing into the mountains. The burned posts weren't just marking what was lost, they were marking what was hidden. Jed spent the rest of the afternoon reading through Marcus's research, and with each page, his respect for his younger brother's intelligence and persistence grew. Marcus had systematically eliminated dozens of theories and possibilities, narrowing his focus through careful analysis of historical records, geological surveys, and physical evidence. By the time he'd reached his final entries, Marcus was convinced that Samuel had buried a significant portion of his wealth somewhere within the circle of posts. November 3rd. The pattern is becoming clear. Samuel wasn't just hiding gold, he was creating a puzzle that only family could solve. The spacing of the posts corresponds to traditional surveying methods, but the angles are off by exactly 15 degrees. That's not surveying. Error, it's intentional. He was encoding the location using knowledge that would be passed down through the family. But the final entry in the journal was different from the others, less analytical and more emotional. December 8th. Jed should be here for this. Whatever Samuel hid, whatever secrets this land holds, they belong to both of us. The fight we had over Sarah was 40 years ago, and she's been gone almost as long. I've been too proud to reach out, and now I'm running out of time. Maybe this inheritance will bring him home. Maybe we can finish what Samuel started, together. Jed closed the journal with hands that weren't quite steady. All these years, he'd thought Marcus had forgotten about their family, had moved on to a life that didn't include the mountains or the memories they'd shared. But Marcus had been here all along, working to preserve something that connected them to their history and to each other. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows, casting long shadows across the maps and diagrams that covered every surface of the cabin. Jed could hear the wind picking up in the pines, carrying with it the promise of weather and the scent of snow from the high country. Winter was still weeks away, but mountain weather had its own schedule, and a man learned to pay attention to the signs. He walked to the window and looked out at the circle of burned posts, seeing them now not as mysterious markers, but as pieces of an elaborate puzzle that his great-grandfather had created over a century ago. Samuel Holt had been a careful man, a man who understood that the real treasures in life were the ones you had to work for. He'd hidden his wealth not just to protect it from thieves or government collapse, but to ensure that only someone willing to understand the family's history would ever find it. Marcus had done the hard work, the research, the analysis, the careful documentation of every clue. Now it was up to Jed to finish what both his brother and his great-grandfather had started, and for the first time in 40 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Marcus's cabin, Jed found something that made his breath catch in his throat, a canvas tool roll wrapped around implements he recognized from childhood memories. His grandfather's mining tools, tools that had been passed down through the family and supposedly lost when their father's barn burned down in 1962. The pickaxe head was still sharp despite its age, the handle worn smooth by generations of Holt hands. The gold pan showed the telltale scratches of a tool that had seen real use, and the small hammer bore the initials SH, carved deep into the hickory handle. Samuel's tools. Somehow, Marcus had found them. A folded paper tucked into the roll explained how. Marcus had tracked down the tools through an estate sale in Billings, purchasing them from a dealer who'd bought them, from the family that had rented the Holt property after Samuel's disappearance. The paper also included a note in Marcus's careful handwriting. "These tools know the ground here better than any of us. Maybe they'll remember what Samuel wanted them to find." Jed carried the tools back to the circle of posts with a sense of ceremony that surprised him. These weren't just implements. They were connections to a man whose decisions had shaped 3 generations of his family. As he hefted the pickaxe and felt its familiar weight, memories surfaced of his own father, teaching him how to read the color of dirt, how to tell hardpan from loose earth, how to follow a promising seam through bedrock and disappointment. The work went faster with proper tools, but it also went deeper. Using Samuel's pickaxe to break the hard ground felt like completing a conversation that had been interrupted over a century ago. Each swing of the tool revealed layers of earth that told the story of this place. The black ash layer from the fire, the older soil beneath that spoke of years when this land had been productive and cared for. But it was the systematic nature of the search that began to reveal patterns Samuel had encoded in the landscape. Following Marcus's diagrams, Jed worked outward from the center of the circle in a careful grid pattern, excavating small test holes at precise intervals. Most yielded nothing but rocks and clay, but a few showed signs of previous disturbance areas where the soil had been dug and refilled, where the normal layering of earth had been interrupted by human activity. "You're drawing attention, you know." Jed looked up from his digging to find Charlie Dunbar standing at the edge of the circle, but this time the old man wasn't alone. A younger fellow stood beside him, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of soft hands and clean clothes that marked him as a town dweller rather than someone who made his living from the land. "Name's David Crenshaw," the younger man said, stepping forward with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I represent certain business interests that have had their eye on this property for some time." Jed leaned on Samuel's pickaxe and studied the man with the careful attention he'd learned to give strangers in the backcountry. Crenshaw had the look of someone who spent more time in boardrooms than outdoors, but there was something predatory in his manner that suggested he wasn't quite as soft as his appearance indicated. "What kind of business interests?" Jed asked. "Mining consortium. This whole area is being surveyed for potential mineral extraction. Your property sits right in the middle of what could be a very lucrative operation. We're prepared to offer you a fair price, more than fair, considering the land's current condition." Charlie spoke up before Jed could respond. "Funny thing about that, Mr. Crenshaw, I've lived in this valley my whole life, and I never heard about any mining survey until after Marcus Holt died." Crenshaw's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Market conditions change, Mr. Dunbar. What wasn't economically viable yesterday might be quite profitable today. The question is whether Mr. Holt here is interested in making some real money from this worthless ground, or whether he wants to spend his golden years playing in the dirt like a child with a sandbox." Jed felt his temper rise at the man's tone, but years of mountain living had taught him the value of patience. "Appreciate the offer," he said evenly, "but I'm not looking to sell just yet." Of course. But you should know that if mineral rights are confirmed in this area, the government has ways of acquiring property for the public good. Eminent domain can be a complicated process, especially for elderly property owners who might not understand all the legal implications. The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Jed straightened up from his work, and something in his expression made Crenshaw take a half-step backward. Mountain men didn't reach 67 years old by backing down from bullies, whether they wore business suits or carried guns. "Mr. Crenshaw," Jed said quietly, "I think you'd better head back to town now. And I think you'd better not come back to my land without an invitation." After the men left, Jed returned to his digging with renewed determination. Whatever Samuel had hidden here, it was valuable enough that modern-day claim jumpers were already circling like vultures. The urgency he'd felt since reading Marcus's journal now had an additional edge time, might be running out faster than he'd thought. As the afternoon wore on, his systematic search began to reveal more evidence of Samuel's work. The pattern of previous excavations became clearer with each test hole, and Jed began to understand that his great-grandfather hadn't just buried treasure randomly. Samuel had created a complex system, using the burned posts as reference points for a grid of hiding places. The breakthrough came just before sunset, when Jed's pickaxe struck something that rang like a bell instead of thudding like stone. Kneeling in the shallow hole he dug, he carefully cleared away the dirt to reveal a corner of what looked like a metal box. His heart hammered as he worked to expose more of the object, but as the last light faded from the western sky, he forced himself to stop and cover his work with a canvas tarp. Samuel's treasure, or at least part of it, was real. Marcus had been right about everything, but now Jed faced a problem his brother had never had to consider: how to extract a century-old secret while keeping modern-day thieves from stealing what 3 generations of Holt men had worked to preserve. As he packed Samuel's tools away for the night, Jed made a decision that would have made his great-grandfather proud. Tomorrow, he would return with better equipment and a more complete plan. Whatever Samuel had buried here belonged to the family, and Jed intended to make sure it stayed that way. The coded family tree Marcus had drawn turned out to be more than just genealogical curiosity. It was a map disguised as family history. Jed discovered this truth when he found the original document tucked between the pages of a mining manual that had belonged to Samuel himself. The hand-drawn chart showed 5 generations of Holt family members, but certain names were marked with small symbols that corresponded to locations on the property map Marcus had created. Each burned post, Jed realized, represented not just a building that had once stood there, but a family member who had contributed to Samuel's operation. The main house post bore the symbol for Samuel himself, while the barn post was marked with the symbol for Samuel's brother Thomas, who had apparently helped with the mining operation before disappearing into the California goldfields in 1894. Every man in the family had a role, Jed murmured, tracing the connections with his finger. And every role had a location. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Samuel had encoded the treasure map using family relationships that would be meaningful to his descendants, but meaningless to outsiders. The distances between posts corresponded to birth years, marriage dates, and other significant family milestones. It was the kind of puzzle that could only be solved by someone who understood both the family history and the land itself. But understanding the code was only the beginning. As Jed worked through Marcus's notes, he began to comprehend the full scope of what Samuel had accomplished. The man hadn't just hidden gold. He'd created an entire system of caches spread throughout the property, each one protected by layers of misdirection and encoded clues. The metal box Jed had found the previous evening turned out to be just the first test. A relatively small cache designed to confirm that the finder understood the basic pattern. When he returned at first light and carefully excavated the container, he found it contained about 2 pounds of raw gold nuggets and a letter written in Samuel's own hand. "If you have found this, you understand the beginning of what I have preserved for our family. But this is only the first of 7 caches, each one larger and more carefully hidden than the last. The posts will guide you, but only if you remember that family is more than blood. It is the stories we pass down and the promises we keep." 7 caches. Jed sat back on his heels and whistled softly. If the first cache contained 2 pounds of gold, and if each subsequent cache was larger than the last, then Samuel had hidden a fortune that would make any man wealthy for life. But the letter contained a warning that made Jed's stomach tighten with unease. "I have hidden this wealth, not just to preserve it, but to protect our family from those who would take what we have earned through honest labor." The fire that destroyed our home was not an accident, and the men who set it will not hesitate to kill for what they believe I possess. Trust no one outside the family. Work alone. And remember that some secrets are worth more than the gold they protect. As Jed reread the letter, he understood why Marcus had worked in secrecy for so many years. The treasure wasn't just valuable, it was dangerous. Samuel had been murdered for his gold, or had at least been driven from his home by men willing to kill for it. Those men were long dead, but greed was a disease that passed from generation to generation. And David Crenshaw's visit proved that Samuel's fears were still relevant more than a century later. The second cache took Jed 3 days to locate, even with Samuel's clues and Marcus's research to guide him. It was hidden beneath the post that marked where the family cemetery had once been, protected by a false bottom that had been carved into the bedrock itself. The excavation required careful work with hand tools to avoid damaging what lay beneath. But when Jed finally pried up the stone slab that covered the hiding place, he found himself looking at a fortune in raw gold and silver that took his breath away. But more than the wealth itself, it was the care with which Samuel had preserved family mementos alongside the precious metals. Wrapped in oiled leather were photographs of Jed's great-great-grandmother, a woman he'd never seen, but whose eyes held the same stubborn determination he recognized in his own reflection. There were letters from family members who had scattered across the frontier, mining tools that had been passed down through generations, and a deed to additional property that Samuel had never told anyone he owned. He was preserving more than gold, Jed said aloud, his voice echoing in the small excavation. He was preserving us. The emotional weight of the discovery hit him, harder than he'd expected. For 40 years, he'd thought himself alone in the world, except for the brother who wouldn't speak to him. But Samuel's caches revealed a family history rich with stories of courage, determination, and the kind of loyalty that transcended death itself. Each item carefully preserved in the hiding places told a story about people who had faced hardship with grace and met challenges with the kind of quiet strength that built the West. But it was the discovery of Marcus's own contributions to the caches that nearly brought Jed to his knees. Wrapped alongside Samuel's treasures were items that Marcus had added over the years. Photographs of Jed taken from a distance, newspaper clippings about Jed's rare appearances in town, even a copy of a letter Jed had written to their parents 20 years earlier, in which he'd mentioned missing his younger brother. Marcus had been watching over him all these years, preserving memories of their relationship, even when they couldn't preserve the relationship itself. The realization was both heartbreaking and healing, a reminder that love didn't always know how to express itself, but rarely truly died. As the sun set on his 3rd day of excavation, Jed sat beside the second cache and tried to process what he'd learned. Samuel's treasure was real and substantial, but it came with complications that extended far beyond its monetary value. The gold represented not just wealth but responsibility to family, to history, and to the memory of people who had sacrificed everything to preserve something meaningful for future generations. Tomorrow he would begin searching for the 3rd cache, but tonight he needed to consider what he would do with Samuel's legacy once he'd found all 7 hiding places. The wealth could change his life, could buy him comfort and security for whatever years remained to him, but it could also buy him danger, as David Crenshaw had already proven. Looking up at the stars that filled the mountain sky, Jed felt the weight of 3 generations of family secrets settling on his shoulders. Samuel had hidden the treasure to protect it. Marcus had spent years working to uncover it. Now it was Jed's turn to decide whether to preserve it or use it, whether to keep Samuel's secrets or share them with a world that might not understand their true value. The tin box of family photographs that Jed discovered in the 3rd cache changed everything he thought he knew about the land and its history. Unlike the previous hiding places, this one had been sealed with particular care, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled canvas and placed inside a wooden chest that had been treated with some kind of preservative that had kept moisture out for over a century. When Jed opened the chest, the first thing that struck him was the smell, the faint scent of cedar and old paper that spoke of precious things carefully preserved. The photographs inside were mounted on heavy cardboard, arranged in chronological order, telling the story of Samuel's life on this land in images that were sharper and more detailed than anything Jed had expected from the 1,890 seconds. The earliest photographs showed the property as Samuel had first found it, raw wilderness with a creek running through it, and stands of pine and aspen that stretched toward the distant mountains. But as Jed moved through the collection, he watched the land transform under his great-grandfather's hands. There were images of the first cabin being raised, of Samuel and his brothers clearing fields and building fences, of the gradual expansion that had turned wilderness into a thriving homestead. But it was the photographs from 1,894 and 1,895 that told the real story. These images showed not just a homestead, but a substantial operation. The main house was larger than Jed had imagined, with a wraparound porch and decorative trim that spoke of prosperity and pride. The barn was massive, big enough to house livestock and equipment for a serious farming operation. There were corrals and outbuildings, a blacksmith shop, and what looked like the entrance to a mine shaft carved into the hillside behind the main residence. Most importantly, the photographs showed the exact locations of structures that had been completely erased by the fire. Where Jed had found only burned posts and scattered stones, Samuel's cameras had captured a world of buildings and fences, gardens and pathways that revealed how the property had been laid out in its prime. But the final photographs in the collection were the ones that made Jed's hands tremble as he held them. These images, clearly taken in the days before the fire, showed Samuel and several other men working frantically around the property. In one photograph, Samuel stood beside a heavily loaded wagon, his face grim with determination. In another, men were carrying wooden crates toward various locations around the homestead, their postures suggesting the crates were heavy and their contents valuable. The last photograph in the collection showed the burned posts themselves, but not as Jed knew them now. In this image, the posts were newly erected and still smoking, their charred surfaces black against the snow-covered ground. Samuel himself stood in the center of the circle, and even across the decades, Jed could see the pain in his great-grandfather's eyes as he surveyed what remained of his life's work. Written on the back of this final photograph, in Samuel's careful handwriting, was a message that made Jed's throat tight with emotion. For my family, who will come after the fire, took our buildings, but not our future. What we have earned through honest labor is hidden where only family can find it. The posts mark not what was lost, but what was saved. The photographs revealed what Marcus's research had only suggested, that Samuel had known the fire was coming and had used the time to hide not just gold and silver, but the accumulated wealth of a successful mining and farming operation. The burned posts weren't just memorials to destroyed buildings, they were markers pointing to the locations where Samuel had buried everything he could save from a life's work. But the photographs also revealed something else that chilled Jed to the bone. In several of the images taken just before the fire, he could see figures watching from the tree line, men with rifles who were clearly not part of Samuel's family or legitimate operation. These weren't random claim jumpers or opportunistic thieves. They were organized, patient, and dangerous. Samuel hadn't just been driven from his land, he'd been hunted. The realization added urgency to Jed's search and weight to David Crenshaw's threats. If Samuel's original enemies had been organized and persistent enough to force him into hiding, then modern treasure hunters might be just as dangerous. The wealth hidden on this property had already cost one generation of Holts, their home and possibly their lives. Jed couldn't let it cost him his life as well. Using the photographs as a guide, Jed was able to locate the fourth and fifth caches over the next week, each one larger and more carefully concealed than the last. The fourth cache, hidden beneath what had been the blacksmith shop, it contained not just gold and silver, but also weapons, rifles, and ammunition that Samuel had preserved against the possibility that he or his descendants might need to defend what they'd inherited. The fifth cache was the most elaborate yet, consisting of multiple chambers carved into the hillside and disguised to look like a natural cave. Here, Samuel had hidden the true fruits of his mining operation, nuggets and dust that represented years of work in the gold fields, along with silver bars and coins that must have represented the savings of a lifetime. But it was in this cache that Jed found something that made him question everything he'd assumed about Samuel's disappearance. Hidden among the precious metals was a leather portfolio containing documents that proved Samuel hadn't just been a successful miner. He'd been a businessman with interests in banks, railroads, and mining consortiums throughout the territory. The man who'd supposedly died in a fire or disappeared into the wilderness had actually been one of the wealthiest men in Montana. The portfolio also contained correspondence that revealed why Samuel had made so many enemies. He'd been fighting a legal battle against a group of Eastern investors who were trying to acquire mineral rights throughout the territory, through intimidation and fraud. Samuel's wealth and his refusal to be bought or bullied had made him a target for men who were accustomed to getting what they wanted through whatever means necessary. As Jed studied the documents by lamplight in Marcus's cabin, he began to understand that Samuel's disappearance had been something more complex than simple exile. The man had staged his own death to escape his enemies, but he'd also preserved evidence of their crimes and hidden it where his family could find it. Samuel hadn't just left a treasure, he'd left a weapon. The question now was whether Jed had the courage to use it. The death certificate was tucked between the pages of a mining law manual in the sixth cache, and Jed almost missed it completely. When he unfolded the official document from Denver General Hospital, his hands went numb, and the paper fluttered to the ground like a dying leaf. The certificate was dated 3 months ago, signed by doctors he'd never heard of, and it declared Marcus Holt legally dead from complications of lung cancer. But Marcus Holt had died from a heart attack, not cancer. Jed knew, because he'd spoken to the attending physician himself, had made the arrangements for Marcus's body to be cremated, had signed papers confirming his brother's identity. Either someone had made a serious clerical error, or Marcus had died twice. Took you long enough to find that one? Jed spun around to find a figure emerging from the evening shadows at the edge of the clearing. Even in the dim light, even after 40 years of separation, he would have recognized that voice anywhere. Marcus Holt walked slowly toward the excavation site, moving with the careful gait of a man whose body had betrayed him, but whose mind remained sharp as winter air. "Hello, Jed." For a moment, neither brother spoke. Marcus looked older than his 65 years, his face gaunt and his hair white as fresh snow, but his eyes held the same intelligence that Jed remembered from their boyhood. He wore the kind of practical clothes that marked him as a man who'd spent time in the mountains, and he carried himself with the quiet authority that had always made him seem older than his years. "You're supposed to be dead," Jed said finally. "I am dead. Officially. The paperwork's all in order. The cremation was witnessed by proper authorities, and you've got the ashes in a nice urn back at your place." Marcus gestured toward the excavation site. "But dead men don't pay taxes, and they don't have to worry about legal challenges to their property rights. Sometimes being dead is the safest way to stay alive." Jed felt anger rising in his throat like bile. "You let me think you were gone. You let me grieve for you. You grieved for me 40 years ago. When Sarah died, this was just making it official." Marcus's voice was quiet but not apologetic. "I needed you to find this treasure on your own, needed to know if you cared enough about family to finish what Samuel started. And I needed to know if you could be trusted with the truth about what we've inherited." Which is what? Exactly. Marcus walked to the edge of the excavation and knelt beside the wooden chest that held Samuel's documents. More than just gold, brother. Much more. Samuel didn't just hide wealth, he hid evidence. Evidence of fraud, murder, and theft that goes back over a century. And some of the people he was fighting are still around today, or at least their descendants are. The pieces began falling into place in Jed's mind, like stones tumbling down a mountainside. Crenshaw. David Crenshaw's great-grandfather was Franklin Crenshaw, one of the Eastern investors who tried to steal Samuel's land through legal manipulation and intimidation. When that didn't work, they burned him out and forced him into hiding. But Samuel was smarter than they gave him credit for. He documented everything, the bribes, the threats, the murders of other property owners who wouldn't sell. All of it preserved in those caches you've been finding. Marcus pulled a thick folder from inside his jacket and handed it to Jed. I've spent the last 4 years putting together a case that would destroy the Crenshaw family's business empire if it ever saw the inside of a courtroom. They know it, which is why they've been so eager to acquire this land. They're not looking for mineral rights, they're looking for the evidence that could send half their board of directors to prison. Jed opened the folder and found himself looking at copies of documents that traced a pattern of criminal activity spanning 5 generations. Bank records, mining claims, property deeds, all of them showing how the Crenshaw family had built their fortune through theft, fraud, and violence. And all of it documented by Samuel Holt's careful record-keeping and preserved in the caches he'd hidden on family land. Why didn't you just take this to the authorities years ago? Because the authorities include judges and politicians who've been in the Crenshaw family's pocket for decades. And because I needed to make sure the evidence was complete before I moved against them. One mistake, one missing piece of the puzzle, and they'd use their influence to bury everything and come after us with everything they had. Marcus stood up slowly, wincing as his joints protested the movement. But mostly because I needed to know if you'd stand with me when the time came. 40 years ago, we let pride and grief tear us apart. I couldn't risk that happening again when the stakes were this high. The silence stretched between them like a canyon neither man knew how to cross. Jed studied his brother's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but all he saw was the same stubborn determination that had driven Marcus to solve Samuel's puzzle in the first place. The cancer, Jed said finally. That part's real, isn't it? Marcus nodded. 6 months, maybe 8 if I'm lucky. That's why I couldn't wait any longer to bring you into this. The Crenshaws have been circling this property like vultures ever since they heard I was dying. If I'd actually died without resolving this, they would have found a way to steal everything Samuel preserved. And if I hadn't been interested in the inheritance, if I'd just signed the papers and walked away, then I would have destroyed the evidence and let the Crenshaws have what they wanted. Some battles aren't worth fighting if you're fighting them alone. Marcus's voice was steady, but Jed could hear the emotion underneath. But you didn't walk away. You came here. You did the work. You figured out what Samuel was trying to tell us. That tells me you're still the brother I remember, still someone I can trust with family secrets. Jed looked around the excavation site, at the tools and equipment that represented weeks of backbreaking work, at the treasures and documents that revealed a family history more complex and dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Then he looked back at Marcus, seeing not the stranger who'd been absent from his life for 40 years, but the brother who'd shared his childhood and his dreams before pride and grief had driven them apart. So what happens now? Now we finish what we started, together. Marcus pointed toward the center of the circle of posts. There's one more cache, bigger than all the others combined. Samuel's final hiding place, where he put everything he thought was most important. We find that, and then we decide what to do with what we've inherited. And after that, Marcus smiled for the first time since he'd emerged from the shadows. After that, we give the Crenshaw family something they've had coming for over a century. And maybe, if we're lucky, We get to be brothers again before it's too late. The original gold cache map that Marcus produced from his jacket pocket was unlike anything Jed had seen in the previous excavations. This wasn't just Samuel's careful handwriting documenting hiding places. It was a master plan that revealed the true scope of their great-grandfather's preparations. The map showed not just the locations of the 7 caches, but the connections between them, the way each hiding place had been designed to lead to the next, in a sequence that would only make sense to someone who understood both the family history and the land itself. Samuel wasn't just hiding treasure, Marcus explained as they studied the map by lamplight. He was creating a test, a way to ensure that only someone who truly understood the family legacy would ever find the final cache. The 7th hiding place was marked at the exact center of the circle of posts, but according to Samuel's map, it couldn't be accessed until all the previous caches had been found and their contents properly arranged. Each cache had contained not just wealth and documents, but specific keys, some literal, some symbolic, that were required to open the final repository. It's like a bank vault, Jed said, studying the intricate diagram Samuel had drawn. Multiple locks, multiple keys, all designed to keep the wrong people out. Exactly. And from what I can determine, the final cache contains more than just gold and silver. Samuel hid the original mining claims there, along with deeds to properties throughout the territory that the family never knew it owned. If even half of this is accurate, we're not just inheriting a treasure, we're inheriting an empire. But as the brothers worked through the night to prepare for the final excavation, it became clear that Samuel's enemies had evolved with the times. Marcus's cell phone rang just after midnight, and the conversation that followed made both men's blood run cold. "That was my contact at the county courthouse," Marcus said after hanging up. "The Crenshaw family filed an emergency injunction 3 hours ago, claiming this property contains toxic materials that require immediate environmental assessment. They've got a court order allowing them to bring heavy equipment onto the land starting tomorrow morning." Jed felt his stomach drop. "They're going to tear the place apart looking for the final cache. Worse than that, they're going to destroy everything we haven't already recovered and then claim the land is too contaminated for private ownership. It's the same trick their ancestors tried to pull on Samuel, just updated for modern environmental law." The brothers looked at each other across the lamplight, and Jed saw his own determination reflected in Marcus's eyes. They had perhaps 6 hours before the Crenshaw family's crews arrived with bulldozers and legal authority. 6 hours to find and secure Samuel's final cache, or lose everything their family had preserved for over a century. "Tell me everything you know about the final hiding place," Jed said. Marcus spread Samuel's detailed drawings across the table, weighing down the corners with rocks they'd collected from the excavation sites. "According to these diagrams, the final cache is accessed through a tunnel system that Samuel carved into the bedrock. The entrance is hidden beneath the exact center of the circle, but it's protected by a mechanism that requires specific items from each of the previous caches to open." "What kind of mechanism?" Samuel was a mining engineer before he was a farmer. He understood hydraulics, counterweights, and mechanical systems that could operate reliably for decades without maintenance. "From what I can determine, he created a lock that works like a combination safe, but instead of numbers, it requires physical keys placed in the correct sequence." Marcus pulled out a canvas bag that contained items from each of the caches they'd already found: gold coins, silver bars, mining tools, documents, and photographs. Each cache contained one piece of the final puzzle. Arranged properly, they should open whatever mechanism Samuel built to protect his most valuable secrets. But even as they planned their approach to the final excavation, both brothers knew they were racing against more than just the dawn. Marcus's illness was taking its toll. Jed could see his brother struggling with fatigue and pain that grew worse as the hours passed. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the circle of posts, They could hear the distant rumble of diesel engines as the Crenshaw family's equipment moved into position for the morning assault. "There's something else you need to know," Marcus said as they gathered Samuel's tools and prepared for what might be their last chance at the treasure. "I've been in contact with a federal prosecutor who specializes in historical crimes and reparations cases. If we can recover Samuel's evidence and present it properly, we can not only protect this land, but seek justice for what was done to our family. Justice for crimes committed over a century ago. Justice for crimes that are still being committed today." The Crenshaw family's business empire was built on stolen land and murdered families. They've been covering up their history for 5 generations, using their wealth and influence to bury evidence and silence anyone who threatened to expose them. But Samuel's documentation goes beyond just what happened to our family. It shows a pattern of criminal activity that continued well into the modern era. Marcus handed Jed a thick folder of documents. Property deeds, mining claims, business partnerships, all of them obtained through fraud or violence, all of them still generating income for the Crenshaw empire today. If we can prove the original crimes, we can force them to return everything they stole, not just from us, but from dozens of other families. The weight of responsibility settled on Jed's shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about family treasure anymore, it was about justice for crimes that had been allowed to stand for far too long. Samuel hadn't just hidden gold, he'd preserved evidence that could right wrongs that went back generations. As they worked by lamplight to set up equipment for the final excavation, Jed found himself thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a solitary mountain man with nothing but his cabin and his memories. Tonight, he was part of something larger, a family legacy that connected him not just to his ancestors, but to a cause that transcended personal gain. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked, as they prepared to begin the excavation that would either vindicate Samuel's sacrifice or see everything he'd preserved fall into the hands of his enemies. Jed looked around the circle of burned posts that had marked this ground for over a century, thinking about the man who'd placed them there as monuments to loss and hope. Samuel Holt had been driven from his land, but he'd never surrendered. He'd hidden his wealth and preserved evidence of the crimes committed against him, trusting that someday his family would return to finish what he'd started. "Samuel waited over a century for this moment," Jed said quietly. "Marcus spent 4 years preparing for it. I think I can handle 1 night of digging." As the first stars appeared overhead and the distant sound of approaching machinery grew louder, the Holt brothers began their final excavation. Whatever they found in Samuel's last hiding place, whatever secrets their great-grandfather had preserved beneath the cursed ground, would determine not just their own futures, but the fate of a family legacy that had survived fire, violence, and 40 years of silence. The time for hiding was over. The time for justice had come, and somewhere in the darkness beneath their feet, Samuel Holt's final treasure waited to be discovered by the grandsons who had finally learned to work together again. The pickaxe bit into the hard ground with a sound like thunder, and the brothers began their race against time. The golden family locket that emerged from the earth at exactly 4:30 in the morning was more than just the first piece of Samuel's final treasure. It was proof that they'd found the right place at the right time. Jed's hands trembled as he wiped away the dirt that had protected the delicate piece for over a century, revealing an intricate design that depicted a mountain landscape with a cabin nestled in the valley below. "Look at this," he whispered, holding the locket up to the lamplight. Marcus leaned closer, squinting through his exhaustion to see the details that had been preserved beneath decades of earth. When Jed pressed the tiny clasp, the locket opened to reveal 2 photographs, a stern-faced man with eyes that held the same determination Jed recognized in his own reflection, and a woman whose gentle smile seemed to reach across the years with warmth and grace. "Our great-great-grandparents," Marcus said softly. "Samuel's parents. I've never seen pictures of them before." But the locket was just the beginning. As the brothers continued their careful excavation in the growing light of dawn, they uncovered evidence of wealth that exceeded even their most optimistic projections. Gold nuggets the size of chicken eggs lay scattered among silver bars that bore the marks of professional refineries. Leather pouches contained gold dust so pure it seemed to glow with its own inner light, and wooden boxes protected coins from mints throughout the Western Territories. "Sweet Jesus!" Jed breathed as they uncovered chest after chest of precious metals. Samuel wasn't just wealthy, he was one of the richest men in the territory, and smart enough to hide it where nobody would think to look, Marcus added, pulling a canvas bag from one of the wooden chests. But look at this, he didn't just preserve wealth, he preserved the family itself. The bag contained dozens of personal items that told the story of Samuel's life and the lives of the family members who had come before him. There were letters from relatives who had scattered across the frontier, daguerreotypes of family gatherings, children's toys that had been carefully wrapped and stored, and a Bible that contained a handwritten family tree going back 7 generations. But it was the sound of approaching vehicles that cut through their celebration of discovery. The rumble of diesel engines and the clatter of heavy equipment announced that the Crenshaw family's crews had arrived earlier than expected, and they were moving fast toward the circle of posts. "We've got company," Marcus said, struggling to his feet and grabbing his rifle from where he'd leaned it against one of the burned posts. Jed looked up from the excavation to see a convoy of trucks and earth-moving equipment approaching across the open ground, led by a black SUV that could only belong to David Crenshaw himself. Behind the lead vehicles, Jed could see the distinctive yellow of bulldozers and excavators machines designed not for careful archaeological work, but for wholesale destruction of everything in their path. "They're not here to search," Jed realized with growing alarm. "They're here to destroy everything and claim the land was too damaged for private ownership." Marcus checked his rifle and handed Jed a second weapon from their equipment pile. "Samuel's final cache is still down there. If we let them tear up this ground, we'll lose everything he preserved, not just the gold, but the evidence." The convoy stopped just outside the circle of posts, and David Crenshaw emerged from the lead vehicle, accompanied by 2 men who had the look of private security rather than environmental technicians. Behind them, the operators of the heavy equipment began unloading their machines with the efficiency of people who'd done this kind of work before. "Mr. Holt," Crenshaw called out, his voice carrying across the morning air with false authority, "I'm afraid you're going to have to vacate this area immediately. We have a court order requiring environmental assessment of potential toxic contamination." "Funny thing about that court order," Marcus called back, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. "I took the liberty of having it reviewed by a federal judge who specializes in environmental law. Turns out your injunction was filed under false pretenses, with insufficient evidence." Crenshaw's confident expression faltered for the first time since Jed had met him. "That's impossible. The paperwork was filed through proper channels." Proper channels that included bribing a county clerk to backdate the filing and forge environmental test results, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger despite his physical exhaustion. "The same kind of fraud your family has been committing for over a century." The standoff stretched across the morning light like a line drawn in the dirt. Jed could see more vehicles approaching in the distance, but these weren't construction crews. The distinctive markings on the approaching SUVs identified them as federal agents, and Jed realized that Marcus had been planning this confrontation for longer than he'd admitted. "You see, David," Marcus said with a smile that reminded Jed of their childhood adventures, "dead men make excellent witnesses, especially when they've had years to prepare their testimony." The last will and testament of Samuel Holt emerged from the deepest part of the final cache like a voice speaking across the centuries. Written on parchment that had been preserved in a specially designed metal container, the document bore the official seals of the territorial government and the witnessed signatures that made it legally binding even after more than a century. But it was the contents of the will that transformed the standoff between the Holt brothers and the Crenshaw family into something approaching a reckoning. As Marcus read aloud from Samuel's final instructions, federal agents moved to surround the construction crews, and David Crenshaw's face went from confident authority to barely controlled panic. I, Samuel Jeremiah Holt, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath to my descendants not just the wealth I have earned through honest labor, but the responsibility to see justice done for crimes committed against my family and others in this territory, Marcus read, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. This is ridiculous, Crenshaw interrupted, but his protest lacked the authority it had carried just minutes earlier. A century-old document has no legal standing in modern property disputes. Actually, it does, said Agent Sarah Martinez, the lead federal investigator who had emerged from one of the approaching vehicles, especially when that document is accompanied by detailed evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy spanning 5 generations. Marcus continued reading from Samuel's will, and with each paragraph, the true scope of the Holt family's inheritance became clear. Samuel hadn't just hidden gold and silver, he'd preserved legal claims to mining rights, water rights, and property deeds that covered thousands of acres throughout the territory. More importantly, he documented the systematic theft of those rights through bribery, intimidation, and murder. The family of Franklin Crenshaw has stolen what righteous men earned through honest work, Marcus read from the will. They have murdered my neighbors, burned my home, and driven my family into exile. But they have not stolen our future. The wealth I have hidden will provide for my descendants, and the evidence I have preserved will ensure that justice is done, no matter how many years must pass before that justice comes. Agent Martinez stepped forward with a warrant that had been prepared based on Marcus's evidence. David Crenshaw, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of historical documents, and violation of federal reparations statutes. The Crenshaw family's assets are hereby frozen, pending investigation of claims dating back to 1895. As federal agents moved to arrest Crenshaw and secure the construction equipment, Jed and Marcus returned to the final cache to complete their excavation of Samuel's inheritance. What they found in the deepest chamber of their great-grandfather's hiding place exceeded even the wealth they'd already recovered. Samuel had preserved not just precious metals, but the complete records of his business operations, bank accounts, investment portfolios, and partnership agreements that had been generating income for over a century. The Holt family hadn't just inherited a treasure, they'd inherited a legacy that made them among the wealthiest landowners in the state. But more than the material wealth, it was Samuel's final letter that brought both brothers to tears. Written in his careful handwriting and addressed simply, "To my family," the letter revealed the heart of a man who had sacrificed everything to preserve something meaningful for future generations. "I do not know if I will live to see my grandchildren, or if they will live to read these words," the letter began. "But I know that family is stronger than the greed of evil men, and love endures longer than the hatred that drives them. The gold I have hidden will provide for your needs, but the memories I have preserved will nourish your souls. Remember that wealth means nothing without family to share it with, and justice means nothing without the courage to pursue it." As Jed finished reading his great-grandfather's words, he looked across the excavation site at Marcus, seeing not the stranger who had been absent from his life for 40 years, but the brother who had spent those years working to preserve their family's legacy. The fight that had driven them apart suddenly seemed small compared to the bonds that connected them to each other and to the generations that had come before. "We did it," Marcus said quietly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion. "We finished what Samuel started." "No," Jed replied, helping his brother to his feet, as federal agents continued their work of securing evidence and arresting the Crenshaw family's associates. "We started something new. Samuel gave us the foundation, but what we build on it, that's up to us." Around them, the circle of burned posts stood like sentinels in the morning light, no longer marking sites of destruction, but monuments to perseverance and the power of family bonds to transcend time itself. The cursed ground had given up its secrets at last, and the treasure it had guarded was more precious than gold. It was the restoration of connection between brothers who had found their way home to each other and to their shared history. 6 months later, the family photograph that Charlie Dunbar took of the Holt brothers would become the centerpiece of a small museum that now occupied the restored main house on Samuel's old homestead. In the picture, Jed and Marcus stood together beside a newly erected monument that bore the names of all the families who had been driven from their land by the Crenshaw conspiracy. Both brothers looked older, but somehow more complete than they had in decades, as if finding Samuel's treasure had helped them find themselves as well. The transformation of the property had been remarkable. Using a portion of Samuel's wealth and working with federal reparations funds secured through the prosecution of the Crenshaw family, the brothers had rebuilt the homestead not as a private residence, but as a memorial to the frontier families who had been victimized by greed and violence. The main house now served as a visitors' center, where people could learn about the history of the territory and the courage of the men and women who had carved homes from the wilderness. The 12 burned posts still stood in their circle, but now they were surrounded by a carefully maintained memorial garden where visitors could walk among native plants and read about the lives of the people who had once called this place home. At the center of the circle, where Jed had first driven his shovel into the hard ground, a bronze plaque marked the spot where Samuel's final cache had been discovered. The inscription, written in Samuel's own words, read, "Family is the treasure that endures when all others fade." Jed lived in a new cabin built near the creek, close enough to the museum to help with daily operations, but far enough away to maintain the solitude that had sustained him through decades of mountain living. Marcus had built his own place on the hillside, overlooking the valley, where he could watch the sunrise, paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. While he worked on the book he was writing about Samuel's life and the legal case that had brought justice to families across 3 states. The Crenshaw family's empire had indeed crumbled under federal investigation. David Crenshaw and 17 associates were serving prison sentences for crimes ranging from fraud to conspiracy to commit murder. The family's assets had been seized and distributed among the descendants of families who had been victimized over the past century. More than 200 families had received reparations, and dozens of properties had been returned to their rightful owners. But for Jed, the most precious outcome of their discovery wasn't the wealth or the justice, it was the relationship he'd rebuilt with his brother. They met every morning at sunrise to drink coffee and plan the day's work, sharing the kind of comfortable silence that only came between people who truly understood each other. The 40 years of separation hadn't been erased, but they'd been forgiven, replaced by a deeper appreciation for the time they had left together. Marcus's illness was progressing as the doctors had predicted, but he faced it with the same quiet determination that had driven him to solve Samuel's puzzle. He'd used his portion of the inheritance to establish a foundation that provided legal assistance to families fighting corporate land grabs, ensuring that the work he and Jed had started would continue long after both brothers were gone. "Do you ever wonder what Samuel would think of all this?" Marcus asked one evening as they sat on the porch of the museum, watching the sun set over the restored homestead. Jed considered the question while sipping coffee from a mug that had been carved from wood taken from one of the original burned posts. Around them, the land showed signs of healing. Native grasses had returned to areas that had been barren for decades. Wildlife was thriving in the restored habitat, and the creek ran cleaner than it had in living memory. "I think he'd be proud that we finished what he started," Jed said finally. "But I think he'd be prouder that we did it together." A small group of visitors was walking through the memorial garden, reading the plaques that told the stories of families who had fought to preserve their way of life against overwhelming odds. Among them was a young couple with 2 children, and Jed watched as the parents explained to their kids about the importance of remembering history and honoring the sacrifices of those who came before. "You know what the best part of this whole thing is?" Marcus said, following Jed's gaze toward the family in the garden. "What's that?" "Those kids will grow up knowing that sometimes the good guys really do win, that family and justice and doing what's right actually matter in the end." As the evening stars began to appear overhead, the brothers sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of coyotes in the hills. The cursed ground had been transformed into a place of healing and remembrance, and the treasure that Samuel had hidden beneath it had proven to be more valuable than gold. It was the knowledge that some bonds are strong enough to survive any separation, and some truths are worth preserving no matter how long it takes to reveal them. In the morning, there would be work to do, visitors to guide, stories to tell, and a legacy to maintain. But tonight, for the first time in 40 years, the Blue Holt brothers were exactly where they belonged. Home, together, and at peace with the choices that had brought them to this place, where family memories were more precious than treasure, and the future was built on foundations laid by those who had the courage to fight for what they believed in. The photograph that would preserve this moment captured more than just 2 men standing beside a monument. It captured the completion of a journey that had begun over a century ago, when Samuel Holt placed his burned posts in the earth and trusted that someday his family would return to claim what he had preserved for them. The treasure had been found, justice had been served, and most importantly, the family had been restored.